For my professional experience placement, I attended 5 different schools over the course of the week. Whilst each of the 5 schools were all located in low socioeconomic areas and had relatively high percentages of students with language backgrounds other than English, the processes and procedures implemented were incredibly diverse.
Similar to Meg, I got the opportunity to experience 5 different schools throughout the week of my observational placement. The schools I attended within the Surf Coast Alliance have a fairly low percentage of Indigenous students, as well as students with a language background other than English. Throughout the week, I observed how each school assesses their students both formally and informally, how they incorporate specialist teaching and ICT, how the teachers build relationships with the students, and how they create inclusive and positive learning environments.
On my placement, I visited the one school over the 5-day period in the Geelong area, and I was placed with a grade 5 class. I thoroughly enjoyed the school I was at and opened my eyes to the value of teaching and how it involved all different components and hard work, but can also be a very rewarding job. My school has an overwhelming amount of students and families that come from a low socioeconomic status, yet my school has an array of ways to make sure each and every student still gets quality education, and I could see that throughout my time there.
On my first day of placement, I took part in a training workshop presented by the Berry Street Education Model. The presentation was aimed at providing educators with a practical toolkit to work with vulnerable students. The organisation valued inclusivity in the classroom and actively sought to encourage educators to demonstrate inclusive practices by suggesting a number of applicable strategies, such as getting to know learners individually and modifying lessons to accommodate for each student's learning ability.
Each school I attended had their own inclusive practices in place to accommodate each student as an individual, ensuring that they were all given the same opportunities to be included and engaged in whole class activities, regardless of their learning or social abilities, creating a supportive and encouraging environment. One of the many ways teachers achieve this outcome is by working together with the educational assistants available in the school. During one class, the students walked to a nearby creek. The teacher adapted the activity so the student in a wheelchair could still participate with his peers and wasn't held back by his disability. In another class, there was a student with social and intellectual learning difficulties. Instead of excluding him from the activity because he couldn't complete the work, he was allowed to go at his own pace and work on a modified task. Many schools also focus on the students' growth rather than their level of ability. This then allows all students to continuously work on improving and doesn't have the potential to single out particular students who are not yet at the level of their peers. This is also highlighted in the Graduate Standard 4.1.
As a lot of the students from the class I was with have English as their second language, at times it was hard for the teacher to include them in class discussions, as most of them kept to themselves and didn't regularly put their hand up to answer questions. However, she needs to make sure everyone has a turn and it's not the same students always talking, while also subtly assessing where they are at with their learning. I also observed my grade at PE, where the teacher continued to make sure each student was included and valued. At one stage, a student was opting out of the game they were learning. The teacher saw that, so she decided that he can take lead on the next activity, which he was thrilled about. This allowed him to not only be included, but feel a sense of worth and increase his self-confidence, highly reflecting AITSL Standard 4.1 to support student participation.
A number of the schools I attended had relatively high percentages of Indigenous students enrolled. At these schools, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture was acknowledged through Indigenous artwork displays, flags, daily acknowledgements, and extensive at-sea educational resources.
Although all the schools I visited had a low percentage of Indigenous students, each school still demonstrated their acknowledgement of Australian history and the Indigenous Aboriginal culture. Most of the schools incorporated ATSI education by embedding it into other areas of curriculum, instead of making it a separate part of learning or extracurricular. The acknowledgement of country and the Aboriginal flag have both been implemented into the 5 schools to showcase awareness and inclusiveness of Indigenous Australians in their community. During a grade 3-4 class, the students were reading through an article about Indigenous Australian art for guided reading. The purpose for the lesson was to assess each student's ability to understand a storyline and pick out the key words and concepts of a book, but at the same time the students were also learning about Aboriginal culture without solely focusing on it. Another school dedicates a term each year to learn about history, with a huge section focusing on the history of Australia. The level of content increases each grade, so they are continuously learning and developing their knowledge. The majority of the schools also display a form of Aboriginal artwork around the classroom or in specific art spaces.
My school has one of the largest populations of students identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background in Victoria, which they must acknowledge and accommodate to. Over the 5 days I was there, I observed that even though the school has a lot of ATSI students, my mentor as well as other teachers I observed didn't make those students feel isolated or made to feel like they were different to other students. At assemblies, they read out an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander acknowledgement, as well as throughout the year, the school holds an array of different events relating to ATSI culture, such as National Sorry Day, NAIDOC Week, National ATSI Children's Day, Indigenous Literacy Day, and so much more. Not only does this show the school is aware of the ATSI students, but shows they include them and humbly welcomes them to be a part of their school. I also observed my grades art class, where I saw on the wall that their students had done a form of Aboriginal paintings, which enlightens me to think that the students have been taught about ATSI culture and that it is included in their education, and demonstrates that the teacher promotes ATSL Standard 1.3 and 2.4.
Education inequalities between male and female students recur in most parts of the world, and every day, at every level, students and educators are encountering contentious, gender-based issues. Gendered patterns are deeply entrenched in the histories of our school systems, and these patterns involve considerable unevenness. During the students' physical education class at School B, the teacher directed her full attention towards the boys and consciously overlooked the girls during a modified game of basketball. As the teacher encouraged the male students to participate in the game, the female students drifted to the sidelines and observed. Not only did the girls miss out on their weekly physical education specialist, they were also led to believe that they were physically incompetent.
Out of the 5 schools I attended, there were no obvious gender inequalities between the students or the teachers in any of the curricular areas or during the students' breaks. One particular teacher would purposely balance out the boys and girls equally to create groups for class activities without making it look obvious or planned. During lunch, the teacher would get involved in games with the students and attempt to get all the students participating and focusing on encouraging and supporting each other.
As children, there is no limit to what we believe we can become. But as girls and boys, we are steered in different directions growing up. This happens because of what we call gender stereotypes, traditional ideas about what boys and girls can or should do. They may not always be obvious, but stereotypes are everywhere, and they start to follow us from our earliest days in the toy store, and continue to influence us when choosing subjects at school. For instance, girls are expected to be good at arts and humanities, while boys are led towards maths and science. When we come across the same stereotypes again and again, they begin to feel natural and start to shape our preferences and career paths. More men go into better paid jobs in the science, technology, engineering and mathematics field, and women tend to choose teaching and social work professions. Acknowledging gender stereotypes and their consequences is the first step towards breaking the mold, so that we build our lives based on our own choices.
Based on enrolment statistics retrieved from the My School website, each of the schools Ashley, Alice and I attended differ considerably in the total number of students, Indigenous students, and students with a language background other than English. It was also fascinating to note the dominance of male students in the majority of the schools, as opposed to the minority of female students. Australia is an incredibly diverse nation, and so it is essential that teachers are applying appropriate strategies to be able to identify what their students know and what they bring to the classroom in their virtual backpack. All students come to school with a virtual backpack of knowledge, experiences and circumstances. However, schools only make use of what is within some students' virtual backpack, those whose assets align with what is necessary in our education system. These students are an advantage in school from the beginning, opposed to students who may not be as privileged on account of their class, culture and gender.
As a lot of the students from my school were from low socioeconomic backgrounds/families, their virtual backpack is something completely different to someone of a higher socioeconomic status. Most of the students were coming to school with little to no English, therefore setting them back massively, which could even affect their future, as Pat Thomas explains that children from situations classified as low socioeconomic have much less chance of completing their full 12 years of schooling and taking further education, and much more likely of being unemployed. The school and teachers must then provide the quality education these students need in order to succeed in their schooling, to make sure that each student is gaining the same opportunity despite what their virtual backpack may hold.
Unlike Meg and Ashley, most of the students who attended the schools within my alliance were from a relatively higher socio-economic background. With that being said, it was clear that each child still has their own virtual backpack, full of experiences and knowledge quite different from their peers. It is important for each teacher to make a conscious effort to understand and acknowledge a child's upbringing and lifestyle, and realise these differences between each child's personal experience outside of the classroom. One situation I remember from placement was about a student that didn't have any lunch for the day. The teacher informed us that it happens with a fair few of her students and is particularly a recurring thing for this student. The teacher went on to say that there's always signs of neglect from the parents, and it's hard for the school to communicate when they don't know exactly what each child or family is going through.